Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My life has been a 15-year conversation with the horizon, a long, unending dialogue spoken in the rumbling bass of a Cummins engine and the high, lonely whisper of the wind over the plains. My name is Stellan, and I am a long-haul truck driver. It is not a life a man chooses. It is a life a man accepts, a bargain he strikes with the gods of distance and time. I traded my presence for a promise. I traded the small daily moments of a normal life, the school plays, the scraped knees, the shared quiet evenings, for a single, shining, and incredibly powerful idea, a future. The architect of that future, its sole trusted custodian, was my wife, Maeve. Our plan, the blueprint we had drawn up in the hopeful early days of our marriage, was as simple as it was solid. I would take on the road, the brutal, lucrative, and soul-crushing work of hauling freight across the continent. I would be the engine of our prosperity. She, with her sharp mind and a real estate license she had earned with my encouragement, would be the investor. She would take the money I sent home, the harvest of my lonely miles, and she would plant it in the fertile soil of the property market. We weren't just paying bills, we were building an empire, one small, unglamorous duplex at a time. The plan was a fortress against the uncertainties of a life like mine, a life dependent on the whims of freight rates and the health of my own aging body. The properties were to be our pension, our passive income, our guarantee that one day the road would finally end and I would be able to come home, not just for a visit, but for good, to a life of quiet, earned, and financially secure peace. Our marriage was a business partnership, and our business was the future. I trusted her implicitly. My job was to drive, to earn, to endure. Her job was to build. I did not need to see the properties. I did not need to understand the complexities of escrow or the nuances of the rental market. I just needed to look at the photograph taped to my dashboard. Maeve and our son Finn, their smiles a beacon in the dim light of my cab. They were my true north, the destination at the end of every long, dark road. For 15 years, I held up my end of the bargain. I drove. I drove through blizzards in Wyoming that turned the world into a white, roaring void. I drove through the suffocating 100-degree heat of the Mojave in August. I sacrificed holidays, birthdays, the entire unfolding narrative of my son's childhood to the relentless, insatiable god of the highway. And I sent the money home. Every 2 weeks, a wire transfer, a digital ghost of my own life force, flying across the country to the joint account that Maeve managed with a brilliant, and I believed, loving efficiency. Our calls were the lifeline that kept me tethered to the world of the living. She would tell me about her latest acquisition, a real gem she had found in a transitioning neighborhood. She would send me pictures of the properties, grainy cell phone photos of small, unassuming houses that, in my mind, were the beautiful, solid bricks of our future. "We're up to 5 now still," she'd say, her voice full of a pride that I shared. 5 little money-making machines, all working for us. "You're doing it, my love. You're really doing it." And I would sit in my lonely cab in a truck stop in some forgotten corner of America, and I would feel a sense of profound and deeply satisfying purpose. I was a man building a kingdom for his family, a kingdom he had never set foot in, but a kingdom nonetheless. I was a good and successful provider. As the years wore on, the road began to take its toll. The miles etched themselves onto my face, into the permanent ache in my lower back. The loneliness, which had once been a manageable companion, began to feel like a chronic illness. I was approaching 50. My son, Finn, was in college, his life a distant, abstract concept I only knew through his infrequent monosyllabic phone calls. The dream of coming home, which had always been a distant, shimmering horizon, began to feel like a real and desperately needed destination. We had a number, a target number for our net worth, the number that would mean I could finally, for good, hang up the keys. And on a Tuesday morning in a dusty depot in El Paso, I did the math. And we were there. We had hit the number. The war was over. I called Maeve, my voice thick with an emotion I had been suppressing for a decade and a half.
"I'm done, Maeve," I said, the words feeling strange and momentous in my mouth. "I'm selling the rig. I'm coming home." The silence on the other end of the line was a little too long, a beat of static that was not from the connection. "Already?" she said, her voice a little thin. I thought we had another year." "The last run was a good one," I explained, my own joy too big to be dampened by her strange, hesitant tone. "We're there. We're finally there. I'll be home in a week. We can finally start living." That's wonderful, honey," she said, her voice regaining its familiar warm tone. "I'll start getting things ready. We'll have a celebration." The journey home was a strange, surreal, and deeply emotional experience. For the first time in 15 years, I was driving not towards another load, but towards the end of the road itself. I sold my truck in Texas, the beautiful, powerful, and loyal machine that had been my home and my prison.
I said goodbye to it like it was a living thing. And then I bought a one-way plane ticket to Ohio. As the plane descended, I looked down at the familiar green landscape of my home state, and I felt like a foreigner returning to a country he had only ever read about in letters. I was coming home to a life I had paid for but had never truly lived. I was coming home to a wife I loved, but who I realized with a sudden, sharp pang of anxiety I barely knew anymore. I was coming home to a portfolio of properties, to an empire of small, money-making machines that I had never even seen. Maeve was there to meet me at the airport. She looked older, of course, but still so beautiful. She hugged me, and her embrace felt a little stiff, a little practiced. We drove home to the small, rented house we had lived in for 2 decades, a house that was supposed to have been a temporary, functional way station on the road to our real life. The first few days were a blur of awkward, gentle rediscovery. We were 2 strangers, trying to remember the language we had once spoken. I was a man who did not know the rhythm of his own house. I did not know where the coffee filters were kept. I did not know the names of the neighbors. I was a ghost, trying to learn how to be a real person again. The celebration she had promised was a quiet, elegant dinner at the fanciest restaurant in town. It was just the 2 of us. "To us," she said, raising her glass of expensive champagne. "To the end of the road." "To us," I echoed, my heart full of a hopeful and slightly terrified gratitude. The next day, I was ready. I was ready to see my kingdom. "Okay," I said at the breakfast table, my voice full of a boyish excitement. "I'm ready for the grand tour. I want to see them, all of them, every single brick I've hauled for all these years." A strange, guarded look came over her face. "Oh, Stell," she said, her voice a little too casual. "It's just a bunch of boring little houses, and they're all occupied. We can't just go bothering the tenants." "I don't want to bother them," I said, my excitement beginning to curdle into a small, cold knot of confusion. "I just want to see them, from the outside. I have the addresses, the ones from the pictures you sent. Let's just go for a drive." She hesitated for a moment too long. "Of course," she finally said, her smile a little too bright. "The grand tour it is." We got in her car. I had the list of addresses in my hand, a sacred, handwritten text I had compiled over the years. I typed the first address into the GPS, a small duplex on the west side of town, the first brick in our empire. As we drove, she was uncharacteristically quiet. The easy, confident pride she had always expressed about her portfolio was gone, replaced by a tense, nervous silence. We pulled up to the address. It was a neat, well-kept little house, just like in the picture. But there was a for sale sign in the front yard. From a different real estate company, not hers. "You're selling it?" I asked, a note of disappointment in my voice. It was the first one. "The market is hot," she said quickly. "It was time to cash in our equity. It's a smart business move, Stell. You have to trust me." I trusted her. I had always trusted her. We went to the next address, and the next, and the next, and the story was the same. Every single property on my list, every single money-making machine that I had spent years of my life paying for, had a for sale sign in the yard. and none of them were from her agency. By the time we got to the fifth and final address, the cold knot in my stomach had grown into a large, jagged stone of dread. "Maeve," I said, my voice quiet, my eyes not on the house but on her face. "What is going on?" She wouldn't look at me. She just stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. "It's a portfolio realignment," she said, the words a string of meaningless corporate jargon. "It's a strategic divestment. It's a good thing, Silas. We're liquid. It's better for our tax planning." I had spent 15 years of my life in a state of almost monastic isolation. But I was not a stupid man. I knew the smell of a lie, and the car was thick with it. I did not say another word. We drove home in a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any blizzard in Wyoming. That night, after she was asleep, I went to her home office, the room that was the command center of our empire. I turned on her computer. I did not know her password, but I was a man who had spent a lifetime figuring out how systems work. I found her password written on a sticky note, hidden under the keyboard. The word was freedom. I opened her files. I opened her financial records. I opened the carefully organized folders that contained the deeds, the tax records, the entire documented history of our empire. And I discovered the truth. It was a simple, elegant, and utterly devastating truth. There were no properties. There had never been any properties. The photographs she had sent me were stock images downloaded from the internet. The deeds were forgeries. The stories of the tenants, of the repairs, of the hot market, it was all a work of fiction. A beautiful, elaborate, and 15-year-long lie. I looked at the bank records. I saw my money flowing in, a steady, relentless river of it, and I saw it flowing out. Not to mortgage companies, not to property management firms, but to a single, recurring name, a name I did not recognize, a man named Alistair. There were plane tickets to Italy, receipts from luxury hotels in Paris, charges from art galleries in New York. I was not building a pension fund of boring little duplexes. I had been funding a 15-year, globe-trotting and breathtakingly luxurious love affair. I stood up from her desk. I looked out the window at the quiet, sleeping suburban street. The house we were renting, the life we were living, it was all a stage set. And my wife, the brilliant, hard-working, and devoted investor, was not a real estate mogul. She was a con artist. And I, Stellan, the proud, sacrificing, and endlessly trusting provider, was not her partner. And I had just discovered that the dream I had finally come home to was not just a dream. It was a mirage, and I had been crawling towards it, through a desert of my own making, for a very, very long time. The truth, once you see it, is a brutal and unforgiving light. It does not just illuminate, it incinerates. It burns away the comfortable, soft-focused narrative of your life, leaving only the stark, charred, and undeniable bones of reality. I stood in the quiet of Maeve's office, bathed in the cold, blue glow of her computer screen, and I watched the last 15 years of my life burn. The fire was not hot. It was a cold, silent, and deeply efficient conflagration, and it was consuming everything. The pictures she had sent, the story she had told, the shared dream we had supposedly been building. It was all just smoke, an elaborate, beautifully crafted illusion, designed to keep the engine, me, running, while the real cargo of my life's work was being diverted to a different port of call, to a different man. My first instinct was not to feel, but to know. The husband in me was a screaming, wounded animal, but the engineer, the logistician, the man who had spent a lifetime analyzing systems, took over. I had to understand the full scope of the failure. I had to see the complete blueprint of the lie. For the rest of that night, I was an archaeologist, sifting through the digital ruins of my marriage. I went through everything: her email, her photo archives, her financial software. I was a ghost, moving silently through the hidden architecture of her secret life. And the story that emerged was a masterpiece of long-form deception. Alistair was not a new development. He was a prequel. He was a man from her life before me, a wealthy, older, and apparently still married art dealer from her college days. She had not chosen me over him. She had, it seemed, simply chosen me in addition to him. I was the workhorse, the reliable, steady, and conveniently absent source of income. He was the passion, the culture, the luxury, the real life that my brutal, unglamorous labor had made possible. The system she had devised was diabolically simple. She had created a phantom empire for me, a collection of boring, believable, and utterly non-existent rental properties. She had fed me just enough data, the fake photos, the plausible stories of leaky faucets and difficult tenants, to keep me invested in the fiction. It was the perfect cover. My own job, my own profound isolation from the real world, had been the key to her success. I was a man who lived in a box, and she had simply and brilliantly controlled what was projected on the walls of that box. The real money, my money, had been the fuel for their life. I found the travel itineraries, the hotel confirmations, the restaurant receipts. They had lived the life of the global elite. They had wintered in St. Bart's and summered in the Hamptons. They had been to the opera in Vienna and the art auctions in London. While I was eating reconstituted mashed potatoes in a truck stop in Laramie, they were likely enjoying a Michelin-starred meal overlooking the Mediterranean. She had not just cheated on me. She had used my life as the raw material for her own far more beautiful and far more exciting work of art. The most painful discovery was not the financial one.
I found her private photo albums, the ones not meant for me. They were full of pictures of her and him, pictures of them laughing on a sailboat, pictures of them at black tie galas. In every photograph, she was wearing a piece of jewelry, a designer dress, an expression of radiant, unburdened happiness that I had not seen on her face in years. She was not the stressed, frugal, and hard-working partner I had spoken to on the phone. She was a different woman entirely, a woman who was alive and vibrant and in love. And I realized, with a new and even more profound wave of desolation, that I had not just lost my money. I had lost a woman who had, it seemed, never really been mine to begin with. The lie was not just about the properties. The lie was about everything. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light into the room, I knew I had to make a choice. The knowledge I now possessed was a weapon. I had the evidence. I had the bank statements, the emails, the photographs. I could destroy her. I could hire a lawyer. I could sue her for fraud. I could expose her to our friends, to our family, to our son. I could burn her beautiful, stolen world to the ground. And a part of me, the raw, wounded, and deeply primal part, wanted to do just that. I wanted her to feel a fraction of the pain, of the humiliation, of the profound, life-altering loss that I was feeling. But then, I thought of Finn, my son. He was 20 years old, a good kid, a smart kid, away at college, living a life that I had, in my own strange and distant way, made possible. His mother, to him, was a hero, the strong, capable, and loving woman who had held the family together while his father was away on the road. The truth, my truth, would not just destroy her. It would destroy him. It would destroy his past, his present, and his future. It would poison every memory he had of his mother. I could not do that to him. My first and most important job had always been to be his provider. And in this final, terrible moment, I realized that the last and most important thing I had to provide for him was the preservation of his own innocent and beautiful lie. My silence was the final and most profound sacrifice I had to make for my son. I would not confront her. I would not expose her. I would do something far quieter and far more difficult. I began to formulate a new plan, a plan not for revenge, but for extraction. I had to remove myself from the equation, but I had to do it in a way that would cause the least possible collateral damage. I went back to her computer, and I began, with the cold, methodical precision of a bomb disposal expert, to erase myself. I deleted the financial records I had downloaded. I wiped the search history. I put the password sticky note back under the keyboard. I was removing the evidence of my own discovery. I was rebuilding the wall of her lie, but this time from the inside. Then I went to our joint bank account. I looked at the remaining balance.
It was not a huge amount. She had been spending it as fast as I could earn it. But it was enough. I made a single final wire transfer. I transferred the entire remaining balance, every last cent, to a new account, a college fund I had secretly set up for Finn years ago, an account she did not know about. I was not stealing from her. I was simply redirecting my final paycheck to its intended and only deserving recipient. The last step was to write the note. I took a piece of paper, and I wrote a story, a new fiction. I told her that I had received a new long-term contract, a lucrative 2-year run to the Arctic, a job too good to pass up. I told her I was leaving immediately. I told her that I would continue to send the money home as I always had. And I told her that I loved her. It was the most difficult and the most dishonest thing I had ever written. I left the note on the kitchen table. I packed a single small duffel bag with a few changes of clothes in my shaving kit. I took one last look at the house, at the small rented box that had been the stage for my 15-year-long performance. And then I walked out the door. I did not take a car. I did not take anything that could be traced. I walked to the nearest bus station, and I bought a one-way ticket in cash to a place I had never been. I was a man who had just lost everything: his wife, his home, his life's work, his past, and his future. But as I sat on that bus, watching the familiar landscape of my hometown recede in the gray morning light, I felt a strange and unexpected sense of peace. I had made my choice. I had chosen my son's happiness over my own truth. And in that choice, in that final, profound act of a father's love, I had, perhaps, found the one single thing in the wreckage of my life that was still real and still worth saving. The world is a very large place when you are trying to disappear. For the next 5 years, I was a ghost. I was a man who lived in the margins and the footnotes of other people's lives. I drifted from town to town, from one dead-end, cash-paying job to another. I was a dishwasher in a greasy spoon diner in Arizona, a fruit picker in the orchards of California, a day laborer on a construction site in Texas. I was anyone, and I was no one. My past was a country I had renounced my citizenship to. My name, Stellan, was a word I never spoke. I was just Stan or Steve or whatever name seemed to fit the transient, invisible life I was living. My only connection to the world I had left behind was a single, anonymous, and untraceable email address. Once a year, on my son's birthday, I would find a public library, and I would log in. I would send a single, short, and cheerful email to his college email account. "Happy birthday, Finn. Thinking of you. Hope you're well. Love, Dad." And I would attach a digital gift certificate to it, bought with a prepaid, anonymous debit card. It was a pathetic, ghostly imitation of fatherhood, but it was the only one I had left. I never checked to see if he replied. To open that door, even a crack, would have been to risk the entire fragile structure of my new, empty life. My life on the road, the life I had once lived in the hermetically sealed world of my truck, had been a form of isolation. But this was a different kind of loneliness. This was the loneliness of a man who is surrounded by people but is connected to none of them. I was a ship in a ghost fleet, sailing alongside other equally broken vessels, all of us maintaining a careful, silent distance. I did not allow myself to think of her. I did not allow myself to wonder what she was doing, if she was happy, if she had ever felt a single moment of guilt. To think of her was to open a door to a room full of poison, and I had to keep that door locked and bolted and barricaded. My life was a flat, gray, and featureless landscape of pure, unadulterated survival.
And then, after 5 years of this self-imposed purgatory, the past found me. It found me in a place as unlikely and as anonymous as any other. A small, dusty public library in a town in southern Utah. It was Finn's 25th birthday. I was there to perform my annual sacred ritual, to send my ghostly digital birthday card. As I was logging into my anonymous email account, I did something I had never done before. On a whim, on a sudden, inexplicable impulse, I typed her name, Maeve, into the search engine. I had not done this in 5 years. I had resisted the urge with an almost superhuman discipline. But on that day, the discipline failed. The search results that bloomed on the screen were not what I had been expecting. I had expected to find a new life, a new marriage perhaps, a successful globe-trotting art dealer by her side. Instead, I found a different story. The first result was a link to a small local newspaper from a town in Connecticut. The headline was a quiet domestic tragedy. Local woman Maeve Jensen loses battle with cancer. The date was from 6 months ago. The world, for the second time in my life, simply stopped. The quiet, dusty library, the hum of the old computer, the bored-looking librarian at the front desk, it all dissolved into a meaningless gray fog. I read the obituary. It was short. It was simple. It described her as a beloved member of the community, a passionate volunteer for the arts. It mentioned her loving son, Finn. It did not mention a husband. It did not mention a partner. It did not mention Alistair. I kept searching. I was a man possessed, a ghost frantically sifting through the digital ashes of a life he had abandoned. I found a link to a fundraising page set up by her friends to help with her medical bills.
And on that page, the full, terrible, and completely unexpected story was revealed. The money, my money, the 15 years of my life's work was gone. Alistair had not been her partner in a grand romantic escape. He had been a predator, an art dealer with massive gambling debts. He had not been her lover. He had been her mark. He had charmed her, he had seduced her, and he had, over the course of a few short and apparently very luxurious years, systematically drained her of every single cent. The empire she had built on the back of my sacrifice had been a paper empire, and it had been consumed by the fire of his own desperate greed. He had left her. He had disappeared, leaving her not just heartbroken, but completely and utterly bankrupt. The cancer diagnosis had come a year later. She had faced it alone. The beautiful house, her parents' house, had been sold to pay for the first round of treatments. But it had not been enough. She had died in a rented room, in a town she had moved to be closer to a specialist, with nothing but the debts from her own catastrophic mistake. The story I had constructed, the story of her as a cold, calculating, and triumphant villain, was a lie. The truth was far sadder, far more pathetic, and, in a way, far more human. She had not been a mastermind. She had been a fool who had traded a life of quiet, steady, and unconditional love for a cheap, glittering, and ultimately counterfeit imitation. And she had paid the ultimate price for it. I sat in that library, a man who had been dead to the world for 5 years, and I wept. I wept for her. I wept for the beautiful, flawed, and foolish woman I had loved. I wept for the terrible, lonely, and frightened end she had met. And I wept for myself, for the man who had been so consumed by his own righteous pain that he had walked away, that he had not been there, that he had let her face the final, terrible consequence of her choices completely and utterly alone. I sent the email to my son, but this time it was different. "Happy birthday, Finn," I wrote. "I know it has been a long time, but I am coming home. I need to see you. I love you, Dad." I hit send, and then I stood up,
and I walked out of the library, and I began the long, slow, and final journey back to a life I had thought was lost forever. The journey home was a pilgrimage of ghosts. Every mile of the road, every familiar sun-bleached landscape was populated with the specters of my own past. The ghost of the young, hopeful man who had first taken to the road, his heart full of a simple, noble purpose.
The ghost of the betrayed husband, his soul a cold, hard knot of rage and disillusionment. And now a new ghost, the ghost of the man who had run away, who had chosen the sterile safety of exile over the messy, complicated, and perhaps necessary business of forgiveness. I did not know what I was driving towards. I did not know if my son would even want to see me. I had been a digital phantom in his life for 5 years, a once-a-year email from a father he had every right to hate. I was a man returning from the dead, and I had no idea if the world of the living would have a place for me. I met him in a small, quiet coffee shop in his college town. He was a man now, 25 years old, with a quiet, steady confidence in his eyes that was all his own. He had my frame, but he had her smile. Seeing that smile, a faint, ghostly echo of the woman I had lost, was a fresh, sharp, and deeply painful wound. We did not hug. We just sat, two strangers who shared a lifetime of history, separated by a small wooden table and 5 years of silence. He let me talk, and I told him everything. I did not edit. I did not soften the blows. I told him the story of the properties, of the lie, of the money. I told him the story of Alistair, of the betrayal, of the choice I had made to disappear. And finally, with a voice that was thick with a grief that was still raw, I told him the story of the library in Utah, of the obituary, of the final, tragic, and lonely end of his mother's life. He listened in a silence that was so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical presence in the room. His face was a mask, his expression unreadable. I had no idea what he was thinking, what he was feeling. I had just taken the entire, carefully constructed history of his life, and I had set it on fire. When I was finally finished, the silence stretched for a long, unbearable minute. "So you left," he finally said, his voice a low, quiet, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was not a question, it was a statement, a verdict. "Yes," I said, my own voice a whisper, "I left." "You left her," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "to deal with the mess alone. You left me with a mother who was falling apart, who was dying, and who had no idea why the one person who was supposed to be her partner had simply vanished." The weight of his words, the quiet, devastating truth of them, was a physical blow. I had been so consumed by my own story, by my own pain, by my own righteous sense of victimhood, that I had never, not once, considered the story from their perspective. I had not been a noble, silent martyr. I had been a coward.
A man who had run away from the mess, who had chosen the clean, simple narrative of his own disappearance over the difficult, complicated, and necessary work of being a family, even a broken one. "She thought you had found out about Alistair and had left in disgust," Finn said, his voice still a dead, flat calm. "But she also thought you had taken all the money. She spent the last years of her life believing that you had not only abandoned her, but that you had financially ruined her, leaving her to face her illness and her death completely and utterly destitute. She died believing you were a monster." The final, most terrible, and most ironic piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My grand, silent gesture of sacrifice, my decision to disappear to protect them, had been the cruelest act of all. I had not saved them from the truth. I had just created a different and, in its own way, more painful lie. I had turned myself into the villain of a story where there had only been victims. "I didn't know," I whispered, the words a pathetic, inadequate apology for a failure of a magnitude I was only just beginning to understand.
"No," he said, and for the first time, a flicker of a hard, cold anger showed in his eyes. "You didn't, because you weren't here. You were on the road. You were a ghost. It's easy to be a martyr when you don't have to stick around to see who gets burned at your stake." He stood up. "I'm glad you're back, Dad," he said, and the word dad was a sharp, cold, and unforgiving thing. "Because you have a lot of work to do. Not for her. It's too late for that. But for you. And for me. Our relationship now is a slow, difficult, and often painful process of reconstruction. We are two strangers, learning to know each other, learning to build a new kind of family on the scorched earth of our past. There is no easy forgiveness. There is no grand emotional reunion. There is just the quiet, daily, and often awkward work of showing up. I sold my truck. I am done with the road. I have a small apartment in his town. I have a simple, boring, and blessedly stationary job. I am learning, one day at a time, how to be present. I am learning that the most profound sacrifices are not the grand dramatic gestures of departure, but the small, quiet, and often difficult choices we make every day to stay. The money, the 15 years of my life's work, is still sitting in his college fund, untouched. It is a ghost in our lives, a silent testament to a story that we are both, in our own ways, still trying to understand. I do not know if we will ever be a real family again, but I know that I am, for the first time in a very long time, truly and completely home. And I am finally, after all the long and lonely miles, ready to start the real work of paying my own long overdue debts. If you've made it this far, tell me, what moment shattered your trust in someone you loved? Drop your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers, where the truth always comes out.